The Millionaire's Deal: How a Homeless Woman's Pregnancy Changed His Life Forever. The man who had everything, but nothing at all. James Aldridge stood alone in his penthouse. The Manhattan skyline stretched before him like a glittering sea of lights. From up here, the city seemed alive, vibrant, full of possibilities. Yet, in the pit of his stomach, James felt the crushing weight of emptiness. The luxurious surroundings, the elegant furniture, the priceless art on the walls, all of it felt irrelevant now. He had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. He had built this empire with his own hands, from nothing. A self-made millionaire, James had weathered the storms of business, fought tooth and nail to secure his place among the wealthiest in the world. Yet, despite the wealth, the fame, and the endless string of successful ventures, there was a growing sense of desolation that gnawed at him every day. His eyes wandered over to the window, but the view no longer held the charm it once did. The city's hum, the constant movement of people below, seemed distant now, as if it was all a world apart. In the silence of his penthouse, James felt the profound loneliness that he could no longer ignore. "I have everything," he thought to himself, "but I'm still alone." He leaned against the window, his fingers tracing the cool glass, trying to steady the tumult of thoughts in his mind. What was the point of all this? The success, the money, the accolades, they seemed hollow. There were no loved ones to share his triumphs with. His 2 failed marriages had left him bitter, disillusioned, and afraid to open his heart again. He had built walls around himself, fearing that love would only lead to disappointment and betrayal. But even with all his cynicism, James couldn't deny the growing ache in his chest. He wanted something more than just business deals and stock market wins. He wanted a legacy, something that would outlive him. A child. But not just any child, a child that would carry his name forward, one who would grow up to succeed where he had left off. He couldn't bring himself to marry again. The thought of entering into another relationship filled with promises that could break was terrifying. He had done it twice before, and both times his wives had only cared for his wealth and status, not for the man he truly was. No, he didn't want love again. He didn't need a wife who would leave once the charm wore off. What he craved now was something simple, an heir, a child to inherit his fortune, to carry on his family name, someone to continue his legacy when he was gone. No emotions, no attachments, just a seed that would grow into the future he had built. That was all he needed. But how could he find someone willing to bear his child without complicating things? James had always been a pragmatic man, someone who relied on logic, not feelings. And so, he began thinking, there must be a way to get what I want, without the emotional turmoil that comes with relationships. It wasn't long before he found the solution. A deal. A contract. But the question remained. Where would he find the woman to fulfill this agreement? The answer came sooner than he expected. The encounter. A chance meeting in the streets. It was a late autumn afternoon in New York City, the type of evening where the wind cuts through the streets with a biting chill, and the glow of streetlights reflects off the wet pavement. The city that never sleeps seemed to be taking a brief pause, its hustle momentarily subdued beneath the gray skies. People walked by, lost in their thoughts, their lives, as they moved from one place to another, each caught up in their own world, unaware of the one that surrounded them. James Aldridge, wearing his signature charcoal suit, stepped out of his black SUV, adjusting his cufflinks as he made his way towards his favorite high-rise office building in the heart of Manhattan. Despite the luxury of the car, the fame of his name, and the wealth he had accumulated over the years, James couldn't shake the feeling that something essential was missing. He often wondered if he could ever fill the void that consumed him, a void that no amount of money or success could patch. As he walked briskly along the sidewalk, the cold wind tugging at his coat, his mind wandered back to the countless business deals he had secured, the gala events he attended, the houses he owned, and the exotic vacations that had long since become routine. He had everything. Or at least, that's what people would say. To him, it felt like nothing at all. The weight of his thoughts pressed heavily on his shoulders as he neared the corner of Fifth Avenue, where the busy city streets met the quieter stretch near Central Park. He slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the crowd of pedestrians. In the distance, something caught his attention. A figure, out of place amidst the polished suits and high heels, a stark contrast to the sleek buildings around them. She was a young woman, no older than 20 or 21, standing on the corner of the street with a look that seemed a mix of desperation and exhaustion. Her clothes were ragged, and her hair was tangled, falling over her face in a messy cascade. Despite the cold, she stood barefoot, her feet pressed against the damp concrete. Her expression was not one of hope, but of resignation. Her eyes were a striking shade of blue, distant, weary, yet somehow still alive. James had seen people like her before, the ones who had fallen through the cracks of society, the ones who had lost their way. He tried not to make eye contact, keeping his gaze straight ahead, but there was something about her that pulled at him. Maybe it was the way she stood there, as if the world had passed her by and she had simply given up trying to keep up. As James walked past her, his thoughts continued to churn, but the distant echo of her voice broke through. "Excuse me, sir, do you have any change to spare?" Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if she had asked this question 1,000 times before, and each time the answer had been the same. People would walk by without a second glance, unwilling to acknowledge the misery standing before them. For a brief moment, James was tempted to keep walking, to ignore her, to let someone else be the one to deal with her. But something inside him stirred, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't guilt, it wasn't pity, it was just a simple human connection, a reminder that for all his wealth and success, he was still a part of the world, a world where other people existed, people who struggled, people who needed help. He paused, turning to look at her. The briefest moment of hesitation passed before he walked toward her. "You need help?" His voice was gruff but not unkind. The young woman looked up at him, her eyes wary. She seemed to weigh him up as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. For a moment, there was silence between them, the kind of silence that can be both heavy and awkward. I don't know where to go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been on the streets for weeks now. I was hoping for some help, that's all." James's chest tightened. He knew what it was like to feel lost, to feel like everything was slipping through your fingers. He had never known hunger, never known true hardship, but he understood loneliness in ways few people did. Loneliness that came not from being physically alone, but from being surrounded by people who didn't really know you, didn't really care. "Where are you staying?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. "Nowhere," she replied, shrugging as though it didn't matter anymore. I stay wherever I can." James looked at her more closely, taking in the depth of her exhaustion. She was young, but the hardships she had endured were written in the tired lines of her face, in the way she clutched her arms around her body as if to protect herself from the world. "I'm sorry to hear that," James said, his voice quieter now. He felt an overwhelming urge to do something, to make sure this young woman wasn't left alone on the streets. It was the least he could do. "Come with me," he said suddenly, surprising even himself with his own words. "I can get you something to eat, and we'll figure this out." She looked at him in disbelief. "You mean, you want me to come with you?" "Yes," James answered simply, already reaching for his phone to summon his driver. "Come with me. It's too cold to be standing out here." For a moment she didn't move. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, almost hesitantly, she nodded. "Okay." They walked together to the waiting car, the silence between them filled with an unspoken understanding. James couldn't quite explain what had just happened. He didn't know why he had offered her help. Maybe it was simply because he couldn't walk away. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his own emptiness. The emptiness that had driven him to this city, to this life of endless success that meant little without someone to share it with. As they settled into the back seat of the car, James glanced at her. She was shivering, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled the worn jacket tighter around her. The car's warmth seemed to ease her discomfort, but her tired eyes remained distant, like someone who had seen too much and given up on finding solace. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" James said softly, his voice breaking the silence. She nodded but didn't speak. James took a deep breath, glancing out of the window at the city lights streaking by. As the car moved smoothly through the streets, he found himself wondering just how many more people like her were out there. People whose stories never got told, whose pain was invisible to the world. People who didn't have the luxury of a warm home, a steady income, or a future filled with possibilities. But tonight, for this woman, there was one thing he could offer: a temporary escape from the cold, a chance to rest, to breathe. As they arrived at his luxurious penthouse, James felt a strange mix of emotions. He wasn't a man who let his guard down easily, yet something about this encounter, this chance meeting, had rattled him. He had never thought much about the lives of people like Emma, never paused long enough to consider the human cost of his own success. But now, as he looked at her sitting silently beside him, he knew this was more than just a fleeting moment of charity. This was the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand. The contract, binding agreements, and new beginnings. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and strange familiarity. James Aldridge had never been the type of person to indulge in impulsive decisions. Every move in his life was calculated, measured, and, above all, controlled. Yet somehow, the decision to bring Emma into his world felt both reckless and necessary. The weight of his choices seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. When he first met Emma, he had intended only to offer a brief respite, a place to stay, a warm meal, perhaps a path out of her current circumstances. But now, after getting to know her a little better, something inside James shifted. The emptiness that had been gnawing at him for years felt less acute in her presence, as though something buried deep within him was slowly beginning to awaken. But the truth was, he didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how to handle her either. Emma had accepted his offer reluctantly at first, her hesitation hanging in the air like a shadow. The moment she stepped into his penthouse, it was clear that she didn't belong in his world. She didn't belong in a space as polished, as pristine as the one he had built for himself. She moved through his home with tentative steps, unsure of where to place her things, as if she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. But James had been nothing if not kind, offering her comfort, space, and an open invitation to share the warmth of his lavish home. He tried not to let his mind linger on the inevitable. Emma's stay, however temporary, was already transforming something within him. But when he looked at her, he saw more than just a young homeless woman trying to survive. He saw a blank slate, a canvas he could mold, shape, and imprint with his own desires and intentions. The thought didn't sit well with him, but it was there, gnawing at the back of his mind like a constant hum. And as much as he wanted to ignore it, he knew that it wouldn't go away. In the days that followed, they spent more time together. James tried to understand her better, to make sense of her life on the streets. But Emma was guarded. Her words were few, and her gaze often distant, as though she was reliving memories she wasn't ready to share. She was polite, but always held something back. He understood that. After all, he wasn't used to opening up to anyone either. But he also knew that time, and the right opportunity, would eventually break through the walls she had built around herself. One afternoon, after Emma had settled in, James found himself pacing the expansive living room, lost in thought. His mind kept returning to the idea that had taken root in his head, the idea of a child who would carry his legacy, who would be the answer to the loneliness that had plagued him for so long. James had always wanted a family, but the thought of marriage, of true love, seemed foreign, unnecessary. He had failed twice before, and the notion of giving his heart to someone else again seemed both unappealing and dangerous. But a child was different. It wasn't about love, not in the conventional sense. It was about legacy, about leaving something behind when he was gone. It was about continuity, about being remembered. And in that moment, James knew that he didn't want to wait anymore. The time had come to take action. He walked into the living room where Emma sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the window. The city below stretched out before them, its sprawling lights twinkling in the distance. But Emma seemed lost in her thoughts, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup in her hand. She hadn't noticed him approach. "Emma," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. She looked up at him, startled, but quickly masked the surprise with a neutral expression. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked, his tone almost casual, though he already knew the answer. Comfort was a foreign concept to her, and even the luxurious surroundings of his penthouse couldn't provide her the sense of belonging she was missing. "It's fine," she replied, her voice soft and reserved. James took a seat across from her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something about her, something unspoken, that made him feel an unexpected connection. He needed to make this clear, to put everything on the table. If he was going to move forward, there could be no ambiguity, no hesitation. "I've been thinking," he began, choosing his words carefully, "about what I need in my life, about what's missing." Emma glanced at him, her expression unreadable, though a hint of curiosity flickered in her eyes. "What I need," James continued, "is a child. Someone who will carry my name, someone who will be part of my legacy." Emma's brow furrowed slightly, a question lingering in her eyes, but she remained silent. "I know this might sound strange, but hear me out," James said, his voice calm and deliberate. I'm not interested in a relationship, not in the traditional sense. I don't need another failed marriage. But what I do need is a child, someone I can raise, someone to carry on after I'm gone." Emma stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any sign of a joke, but there was none. This was serious, and she knew it. She had no idea why he was sharing this with her, why he thought she would be the one to help him. "I'm offering you something in return for your cooperation," James said, his voice cool and calculating. "You would be taken care of. You'll have everything you need during the pregnancy. I will provide for you and make sure you're comfortable, and once the child is born, you'll be free to leave, no questions asked." Emma's pulse quickened, and she could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't just an offer, it was a proposition, a transaction. Her first instinct was to recoil, to say no, to walk away. But something about his words, his calm demeanor, made her hesitate. She wasn't stupid. She knew the weight of what he was asking. A child, his child. It was an offer that could change everything. She took a deep breath and spoke slowly, carefully. "What makes you think I would agree to this?" James leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Because you have nothing left. You're lost. I can give you what you need. Security, a way out. And in return, I get what I want." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't just a deal. It was a life-altering decision. She had no family, no support. Her days on the streets had worn her down, drained her of the hope she once had. Was this her chance to escape it all? To have a future, a life that didn't involve begging for scraps? She met his gaze, the weight of the decision hanging in the air between them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll do it." James's lips curled into a faint smile, a smile that held no warmth, but it was a start. A deal had been struck, and in that moment, he knew that everything was about to change, for both of them. The pregnancy, new lives, new challenges. Emma didn't cry when she saw the two faint pink lines on the test. She didn't smile either. She just sat there, alone in the marble bathroom of the Aldridge estate, staring at the plastic stick in her hand, heart pounding against her ribs. The silence around her felt too loud. This was it. It had worked. She was pregnant. Somewhere, in another part of the mansion, James Aldridge was probably in a boardroom on a video call, sealing another multi-million-dollar deal. She imagined him, composed and unreadable, while her entire world tilted under her feet. Emma's pregnancy began in silence. James didn't say much when Stephanie delivered the news to him, just nodded slightly and resumed reviewing his emails. But something flickered in his eyes. Not joy, not fear, just stillness. Like a man who had arrived at a destination but hadn't quite realized it yet. The first few weeks were quiet. Emma spent most of her time in the East Wing, where James had arranged a fully furnished suite for her. It had everything: sunlight streaming through tall windows, a stocked bookshelf, a grand piano no one played, and silence. Endless silence. But then the morning sickness came, and that was when everything started to shift. The first time Emma vomited in the hallway, she was mortified. She hadn't made it to the bathroom. Stephanie rushed to her side, but Emma waved her away, struggling to clean the floor herself with trembling hands. "You don't have to do that," came a voice behind her. James. He stood at the edge of the hallway, still in his pressed suit, holding a glass of water and a towel. "I thought you were in the city," Emma said weakly, wiping her mouth. "I was," he replied. "But Stephanie called, said you needed something. I don't like messes, but this isn't one of them." That night, for the first time, James sat with her at dinner. It was quiet, awkward at first, but not cold. There was something different in the way he watched her, like he was seeing her not just as a means to an end, but as someone fragile, real. As the weeks passed, Emma's body changed. So did the air between them. James started to check in more often, not just with logistics, but with soft, unexpected questions. "Are you sleeping well? Do you still like those chamomile teas? I had a nutritionist review your diet. Hope you don't mind." It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was care. Subtle, restrained care, like a man afraid of his own tenderness. And Emma, though she tried to keep her guard up, felt something shift within her too. One afternoon, while Emma was reading on the terrace, James sat down across from her with 2 cups of tea. She raised an eyebrow. "What's the occasion?" He shrugged. I figured if we're going to share a child, we should at least learn how to share a pot of tea. She chuckled softly. Is this your idea of bonding? He gave her a half smile. It's a start. They talked for nearly an hour that day, about nothing and everything, about Paris, where Emma once dreamed of studying art, about James's boarding school years in Switzerland, about the time he broke his arm trying to skateboard as a teenager, something Emma found hilariously hard to believe. He was still guarded, but something cracked open that day. And Emma saw it, the boy beneath the billionaire, the human beneath the contract. But not all days were warm. The second trimester brought new challenges, back pain, mood swings, emotional meltdowns. One evening, Emma broke down over something as small as a missing pair of socks. I can't even reach my toes, she snapped at Stephanie. I hate this. I hate feeling helpless. Stephanie stayed calm, but Emma fled to her room and slammed the door. James came up 10 minutes later. He didn't knock. He just entered, holding a bowl of warm water, a towel, and a bottle of lotion. Feet up, he said simply. She blinked. What are you? I may not understand pregnancy, but I understand sore feet. He crouched down and began massaging her swollen ankles. Emma couldn't stop the tears this time. Why are you doing this? She asked in a whisper. James paused, then said softly, because you're not just a contract, Emma. You're carrying my child. That matters. And yet the contract never left the room. Every ultrasound appointment, every doctor's visit, every emotional milestone, they were all shadowed by the silent ticking of time. Emma knew the deal. Carry the child, receive her payout, and leave. But with each passing day, the baby became more real, and so did her bond with James. He started joining her for walks in the garden, brought her books, showed her old family photo albums, the only time she'd ever seen his face soften with nostalgia. One rainy afternoon, Emma found herself painting in the solarium, lost in thought. The canvas showed a mother and child, faceless, surrounded by gold light. James stood in the doorway watching her. You're talented, he said. Emma didn't turn around. It's easier to paint things I'm afraid I'll never have. He walked in slowly. What do you mean? She looked at him finally, her voice trembling. A child, yes, but a family, a home. I don't know if that's part of the package. James didn't respond, but his eyes said everything. He hadn't thought that far ahead, or perhaps he'd tried not to. The third trimester was the hardest. Emma struggled with sleep, with fear, with imagining the day she'd give birth, and then say goodbye. One night, unable to rest, she went downstairs to find James already in the library, sipping whiskey alone in the dark. Can't sleep? He asked, pouring her some warm milk. No, she whispered. The baby's kicking a lot tonight. I think he knows I'm scared. James leaned back in the leather chair. I am too. Emma turned to him, surprised. You? He nodded. I thought this would be simple, a contract, a child, a legacy. But every time I see you hold your belly, every time I hear that heartbeat, I realize how little I understand about life. There was silence. Then Emma said quietly, sometimes the scariest things are the ones that matter most. James looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the contract disappeared. And all that remained was two people, alone in the night, clinging to the only thing that still felt real. The baby shower was small, just James, Stephanie, a few staff, and some friends of Emma from her shelter days whom she'd asked James to invite. There were no expensive gifts, no grand gestures, just laughter, cupcakes, a playlist of lullabies. Emma's eyes lit up when her old friend Marisol arrived with a handmade quilt stitched from old clothes and donated fabric. She's going to be loved, Marisol said, placing a hand on Emma's bump. Emma smiled, blinking back tears. Marisol gasped. You finally found out? Emma nodded. Last week. James had been there. He hadn't planned to go, but when Stephanie texted him from the clinic, he'd shown up 15 minutes late, breathless and flushed. When the doctor said, "It's a boy," James didn't say anything, but he smiled, really smiled. One night, just 2 weeks before her due date, Emma sat by the nursery window, watching the stars. Her belly was round and tight, her breath short. She felt everything and nothing all at once. James joined her, handing her a small velvet box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it. Inside was a delicate gold chain with a tiny star pendant. "For him," James said, "so that wherever he goes, he remembers where he came from." Emma stared at him, overwhelmed. "And what about me?" she whispered. James hesitated, then reached into his pocket again. This time, he handed her a folded piece of paper. Her breath caught when she saw it. It was the contract. But it had been marked, scribbled on, slashed across, sections blacked out. At the bottom, James had written, "This no longer defines us." Emma didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just took his hand in hers, and for the first time, held it without fear. The birth. A moment that changes everything. It began with a dull ache in the middle of the night. Not sharp, not unbearable, but different. Emma sat up slowly in bed, the silk sheet sliding off her belly. She pressed a hand to her stomach. The baby shifted inside her like a tide turning. It was 2 weeks earlier than her due date. She breathed in, trying to calm herself. The room was dimly lit with the faint blue glow of the moon pouring through the curtains. She waited. Another cramp. Stronger. Then, a trickle of warmth down her legs. Her water had broken. Emma didn't panic, not outwardly at least. She reached for her phone and called the number James had insisted she memorize, his private line. No assistants, no intermediaries, just him. It rang twice before his groggy voice answered. "Emma?" There was no hesitation in her tone. "It's time." The line went silent for a beat. Then she heard the rustle of bedsheets and his sharp inhale. "I'll be there in 5 minutes. Don't move," she smiled faintly. "Not planning on running a marathon, James." By the time he arrived at her door, hair tousled and shirt half-buttoned, she was already seated on the edge of the bed with her hospital bag at her feet. He crouched before her, placing a steady hand on her knee. "Pain level?" he asked, like a man used to assessing emergencies with precision. 6, maybe 7, but climbing. "I called ahead. The car's ready. Let's go." They moved together, wordless but aligned. Emma was amazed by how calm he seemed. But as she stepped into the back seat of the black Range Rover, she caught a glimpse of his hands, clenched tightly on the steering wheel. White-knuckled. She said nothing. The drive to the hospital felt like a lifetime. James ran every red light he could justify, his usual restraint thrown to the wind. Meanwhile, Emma gritted her teeth through each contraction. Sweat beaded at her temples, but her voice was steady. "Didn't think you'd be the reckless driver type," she muttered between breaths. James didn't look away from the road. "Didn't think I'd ever be in this situation," she chuckled, then groaned. "Join the club." When they finally arrived at St. Catherine's, the nurses were ready. She was wheeled into a birthing suite, modern, bright, and warm. James was by her side the entire time. The hours blurred. 12 long, agonizing hours. Pain, breath, sweat, silence. Emma drifted in and out of lucidity, holding James's hand like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. At one point, in the middle of a particularly intense contraction, she snapped at him. "You're the one who wanted a baby. Trade places with me if you're so calm." He blinked, then, shockingly, laughed. "Deal," he whispered, brushing hair from her face. "If I could, I would. I swear to God, Emma, I would." His voice cracked. For a man who had always been perfectly composed, it was the most honest thing she had ever heard from him. By hour 13, the room was filled with beeping monitors and medical voices. The OB-GYN, Dr. Renner, gave her one final instruction. "Last push, Emma. He's almost here." James stood by her side, hands trembling as he squeezed hers. Emma bared down with a cry that echoed off the walls, and then everything stopped, followed by the sound, that beautiful, ragged cry. A baby. Their baby. Emma collapsed back into the pillows, drenched in sweat and tears. She barely registered the flurry of movement, the nurses cleaning the newborn, wrapping him in a blanket. Her body ached, her heart raced, and then James was standing beside her, holding the tiniest bundle in his arms. He looked broken, in awe, completely unguarded. His eyes, red with emotion, never left the child's face. "I didn't think I could feel this," he murmured. Emma turned her head weakly. "Let me see him." He lowered the baby gently into her arms, and just like that, the room faded. She looked at the child and saw not just life, but redemption. He had her mouth, James's eyes, a fragile little being who had no idea how much he had already changed the world. The baby was placed in a small bassinet beside her bed. Nurses quietly checked her vitals, dimmed the lights, and exited. James remained. He sat in the armchair, elbows on knees, staring at the baby like a man who'd just discovered fire. Emma turned to him slowly. "You okay?" He didn't answer right away. Then he whispered, "He has your strength." Emma smiled through her exhaustion. "That's generous." "I'm serious," he said. "You carried him. You endured all of this. I planned the contract, the logistics, the timing, but nothing could have prepared me for this moment." He paused. "I thought I was giving life a purpose, but you were the one who gave me mine." That night, James didn't leave. He stayed in that chair, watching over both of them. When Emma stirred at 3 a.m., her back aching, she found him by the bassinet, gently rocking it with one hand. "I thought you had a team for that," she teased softly. He turned around. "I did. I let them go." Emma blinked. "You let them go?" "They can't do what I want to do now," he said quietly. "And what's that?" He hesitated, then said simply, "Be a father." The days that followed were full of firsts. The first time James changed a diaper, he wore gloves, and the look of horror on his face made Emma laugh until she cried. The first time the baby wrapped his tiny fingers around James's pinky, he froze, as if touched by a divine force. The first time Emma fell asleep and woke to find James had already bathed and swaddled their son, his hair still damp, his cries soothed. One morning, Stephanie entered with fresh clothes for Emma and paused when she saw James asleep on the hospital cot, the baby curled on his chest. She turned to Emma with a soft smile. "He's changed." Emma looked down at the sleeping pair. "He's still changing." But amidst the joy, shadows lingered. The contract, the clause, the countdown. Emma's days were numbered just 3 weeks before she was supposed to leave the estate and relinquish custody. It had always been part of the deal. No strings, no attachments, no claims. She had signed it. She had agreed. But now, looking at her son, his perfect little fingers, the way he quieted only when she held him, her heart rebelled. She wasn't sure she could go through with it. And from the way James was starting to look at her, softer, longer, almost as if afraid to say something, she wondered if he felt the same. On the final day before discharge, Dr. Renner visited to run final tests. Afterward, she turned to James and Emma with a smile. Healthy baby, healthy mom. But one thing stood out. They both perked up. "Your son's heartbeat?" she said gently. "It has a slight rhythm pattern, nothing dangerous, but unique." James frowned. "Unique how?" Dr. Renner smiled. "It mimics something I've only heard once before, in another patient years ago. The beat was almost musical, rhythmic. We used to call it the whisper of the mother's soul. It's poetic, but I think it fits." Emma blinked rapidly, emotions surging. James reached out and took her hand. No words, just a quiet understanding. That this boy, this child, wasn't born of a contract. He was born of something deeper, something neither of them had expected, but now couldn't deny. As they left the hospital, Emma sat in the back seat, the baby in a carrier beside her. James opened her door, helping her inside gently. As he slid in next to her, their eyes met. "Home?" he asked. Emma didn't speak at first, then she nodded slowly. "Yes, home." But she wasn't just talking about the house. She was talking about them, the struggle, love, and loss. The days following their return from the hospital were quieter than Emma expected. Not silent, but filled with a strange tension she couldn't quite name. The baby, whom they had finally named Oliver, slept in the sunroom during the day and curled against her chest at night, his tiny breaths like whispers against her collarbone. James moved through the house like a man relearning how to live, his tailored suits replaced by soft sweaters and jeans, his phone calls shortened, his meetings often canceled. He would stop in the middle of the hallway just to peek into the nursery and watch Oliver sleep, sometimes staying so long that Emma would find him leaning against the doorframe, unmoving. There was a gentleness to him now, but also a restlessness, like a storm forming just beneath the surface. Emma tried not to think about the contract, the clause that loomed over her like a ticking clock, but it was there in every quiet moment, in every lingering glance James gave her when he thought she wasn't looking. 3 weeks. That was all she had left. And yet, nothing had been discussed. No one said anything, but the silence screamed. Then came Sunday. James had insisted on a small lunch in the garden to celebrate Oliver's first week home. The sky was crisp and blue, and Emma wore a soft blue dress James had picked out himself. For the first time in a long while, she let herself feel something close to hope, But the moment was shattered by the arrival of Celia Aldridge, James's aunt, a woman of icy elegance, eyes sharp as winter, and lips that rarely curved into anything resembling warmth. She hadn't visited the estate in nearly 2 years, but when she stepped into the garden, escorted by a stiff-looking butler, everything shifted. Emma felt it in her bones. "James," Celia said, her voice as smooth as silk and twice as cutting. "You didn't mention you'd be playing house with your surrogate." James stiffened, setting down his wineglass. "Celia, I thought you were in Florence." "And missed the unveiling of your heir?" she replied, walking toward the stroller with calculated grace. "I had to see for myself what the papers wouldn't dare print." Her eyes landed on Emma, scanning her like she was a piece of furniture too plain for the room. "So this is the girl," she murmured. "A curious choice. I assume she won't be staying much longer?" Emma didn't flinch, but her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. James stood slowly, a warning in his tone. "Celia, she's the mother of my son." "By agreement," Celia said coolly. "A deal. I've read the contract, James. I made sure your lawyers were protected. This arrangement was never meant to blur lines." Emma stood then, not loudly, not in anger, but with quiet, unmistakable strength. "You don't need to speak for him," she said softly, holding Celia's gaze. "Or for me." Celia's eyes narrowed. "And you don't need to pretend this is anything more than a transaction. I know girls like you, grateful, obedient, eager to believe a warm bed and kind words are promises." James's voice sliced through the tension. "Enough." He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. Even Oliver stirred in the stroller. Celia turned to him, eyebrows raised. "You're really letting this charity case dictate your legacy?" James took a breath, as if calming a rising wave. "No," he said. "I'm letting my heart do that for once." The silence that followed was deafening. Celia left shortly after, but the damage lingered. That night, Emma sat by the nursery window, watching the moonlight brush against the hardwood floors. James entered quietly, barefoot, a glass of water in his hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "She shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Emma didn't turn to look at him. "But she's right, isn't she? That's what this was. A deal. I carry your child, I walk away, you raise him in a palace, and I disappear." James stepped closer. "It was what I thought I wanted, what I thought I could handle, but nothing about you or Oliver has gone according to plan." Emma finally faced him. "Then say it. Say what you really feel." He faltered. "I don't know how to." She smiled sadly. "Then maybe I should go before you remember why you wrote that contract in the first place." James reached for her hand, but she stepped away. "I need to breathe, James. I need space to figure out if this, any of this, is real." He didn't stop her. Not with words, not with pleas. He watched her leave the room, the silence once again filling the space they used to share. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did she. In their separate corners of the mansion, both of them wondered, had they already lost what they barely dared to hope for? And in the nursery, little Oliver slept on, unaware that the people who loved him most were drifting apart just when they needed each other most. The decision. Breaking the contract. The mansion was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that wrapped around the walls in comfort, but a brittle, hollow stillness, the kind that echoed every missing footstep, every breath not taken. Emma had moved into the guest wing 3 nights ago. It wasn't far from the nursery, but it felt like a different world. She hadn't said much since that day in the garden. James hadn't asked her to. Both of them were walking through the same house but in separate orbits, held together only by the soft cries of the baby they both loved. James found himself standing at the door of the nursery more often than he wanted to admit. He would watch Oliver sleep, listen to his little sounds, sometimes lifting him just to hold him close. The way the baby curled into his chest, how he stopped crying when James whispered lullabies he barely remembered from childhood. These were the moments that chipped away at the stone wall he had spent years building around his heart. But every time he turned to look behind him, Emma wasn't there. The absence gnawed at him. He tried to drown it in work, buried himself in meetings, spreadsheets, contracts, but none of it made sense anymore. What was the point of building empires when the one thing he wanted most couldn't be negotiated? On the 4th evening, James sat in his office, surrounded by papers he couldn't focus on, when Stephanie, his longtime housekeeper, entered with a soft knock. She held a thick envelope in her hands. "She asked me to give this to you," she said gently. "Said it's time." James took it without a word. As Stephanie turned to leave, she hesitated at the door. "You've built many things in your life, sir," she said softly. "Don't let pride destroy the one thing that wasn't built. It just grew." When she was gone, James opened the envelope. Inside was the original contract, the document he had drafted with such clarity, such detachment. Every clause was highlighted, every condition neatly outlined. On the last page, in Emma's handwriting, was a note. "I was supposed to disappear, I know that. But I didn't expect to fall in love. With him, with you, with us. I thought I could walk away, but now I'm not sure I can breathe without this family. I won't ask you to tear this up, but I need you to decide if this still feels like a transaction or something more." James sat frozen. The words blurred, not from confusion, but from the pressure building behind his eyes. For a man who had mastered every deal, controlled every outcome, he suddenly felt utterly lost. That night, he walked past the guest wing but didn't knock. Instead, he went to the nursery, held Oliver close, and whispered, "Your mother's the bravest person I've ever known, and I've been a coward." He stayed there until dawn. When morning came, Emma stood in the kitchen, her bag packed. She wore a simple coat, no makeup, her hair pulled back into a braid. There was nothing dramatic in her posture, just quiet resolve. James entered, holding a piece of paper. She raised her eyes. "I was going to say goodbye." "You don't have to," he said quietly, handing her the paper. It was the contract, ripped into pieces and taped back together, only this time with words scrawled in ink over every clause. Nullified, replaced by love. Emma's breath caught. "James, I was wrong," he said, stepping closer. "About everything. About what I needed. About what I thought I could control. I don't want a contract. I want you. I want our family. Not because you're the mother of my son, but because somewhere along the way, you became the mother of my hope." She didn't speak for a long time. Then slowly she set her bag down. "I was so scared you'd only ever see me as part of a deal." "I did," he admitted, eyes glistening. "But that was before I knew what it meant to lose you, even while you were still under the same roof." Emma reached for his hand. "Then don't ever let go again." He pulled her into an embrace, fierce and fragile at once. Oliver stirred in the next room, his cries piercing the silence like a soft hymn to something new. Together, they walked toward the nursery, side by side, not bound by ink or wealth, but by something far more difficult to name and infinitely harder to break. Love, once buried beneath layers of fear and control, had finally found its way to the surface, and neither of them would ever be the same again. The new family, a future filled with love. It was a Sunday morning in early spring. The first light of dawn filtered through the tall windows of the Aldridge estate, dancing across the polished hardwood floor like soft music. Outside, the garden was in bloom, crocuses peeking out from under the thawing soil, cherry blossoms dusting the air with pale pink. Inside, the once sterile mansion had transformed, not because of new furniture or expensive art, but because of laughter, because of toys left on the floor, because of the sweet sound of a child babbling in the background. In the nursery, Oliver was trying to crawl. His little arms reached forward in determined bursts while his parents watched from the floor, cheering him on like he was conquering Everest. "Come on, buddy," James whispered with the kind of softness no boardroom had ever witnessed. "You can do it." Emma smiled, holding a soft stuffed bear just out of reach. "You're almost there, love. Just a little more." And then, with a tiny grunt and an awkward shuffle, he did it. His first full crawl. The room erupted in joyous gasps. James scooped him up and spun him gently, both of them laughing. "You did it," he whispered into his son's tiny ear. "You're incredible." Emma leaned into James, resting her head on his shoulder, wrapping her arms around them both. "So are you." Their days were no longer marked by meetings and acquisitions. James still ran his company, but with new priorities. He came home early. He helped with bedtime stories. He learned to cook, terribly at first, but now had 3 decent pasta recipes under his belt. Every weekend, they would visit the park near the edge of the city. It wasn't the fanciest place, just a few swings and an old carousel, but it became theirs. Oliver loved the carousel horses, and James, who once scoffed at anything whimsical, would lift him up with pride, holding him steady as the ride spun slowly around. Emma always took photos. She had dozens now, printed, not just stored on a phone, and placed them into a scrapbook titled Us. One evening, while Oliver slept peacefully upstairs, James and Emma sat on the back patio watching the stars. A soft breeze moved through the trees. James took her hand and, for a moment, said nothing. Then he turned to her and asked, not as a businessman, not as the man who had once offered her a contract, but as the man who had chosen her every day since, "Will you marry me? Not because we have a child, not because it makes sense, but because I love you, because I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what that means?" Emma looked at him, her heart full. There were no tears this time, just joy, quiet and complete. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes. Their wedding was small, just them, Oliver, Stephanie, a few close friends, and a string quartet in the garden. Emma wore a simple cream dress, barefoot in the grass. James looked at her like he was seeing sunlight for the first time. When they exchanged vows, there were no grand speeches, just words from the heart. "You found me when I didn't know I was lost," Emma said, "and you stayed. That's all the magic I'll ever need." Years passed. Oliver grew taller. His laugh grew louder. The house filled with more stories, of scraped knees and school plays, of holidays by the sea and rainy Sundays making pancakes. They weren't perfect. No family is. But their love was real, forged in the fire of circumstance and shaped by every choice they made after. James never went back to who he was before. He didn't want to, because he had learned that legacy isn't built on money or buildings or names carved in stone. It's built in quiet rooms at bedtime, in kisses on scraped elbows, in holding hands through joy and sorrow. Emma never forgot where she came from. Sometimes she'd walk through the city and sit for a while near the spot where she and James first met. Not to dwell on the past, but to honor it. To remind herself that sometimes the lowest moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings. And as Oliver drifted off to sleep one night, older now, curled between his two parents, he asked, "How did we become a family?" Emma looked at James. James looked at her. And together they answered, by saying yes to something that scared us, and then saying yes again, every day after that. Because love isn't a contract, it's a choice, one you make again and again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And in that choice they found not just each other, they found home.